He was sitting alone at a table for two, staring at the empty seat across from him. I watched from the other side of the restaurant, champagne glass in hand, my ex's fingers brushing mine. It was our anniversary, and I wasn't with my husband. The flowers on his table were starting to wilt. He kept checking his phone. I knew he was texting me. I'd turned off my notifications an hour ago. That night destroyed everything. My marriage, my family, my reputation. But honestly, part of me still thinks I had my reasons. Let me go back 6 months. That's when everything started falling apart, though nobody noticed but me. My name is Nicole Bennett. I'm 32, work as a receptionist at a dental office, and I'd been married to David for 8 years. 8 years of the same routine, the same conversations, the same predictable life. David worked in accounting at a manufacturing plant. He left at 7 every morning, came home at 6 every evening, watched TV until 10, then went to bed. Weekends were groceries on Saturday, his parents' house on Sunday. We didn't have children. I'd wanted them once, but David kept saying we should wait until we were more financially stable. Then it became wait until he got his promotion. Then wait until we moved to a bigger place. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. People thought we were fine. We didn't fight. We didn't cause drama. We were just there, existing next to each other. The loneliness crept in slowly. I'd try to start conversations about my day, about things I'd read online, about places I wanted to visit. David would nod and say that's nice while scrolling through his phone. I'd suggest we go out for dinner somewhere new. He'd say we should save money. I'd wear a new dress. He wouldn't notice. My sister Rebecca understood. She'd been through a divorce 3 years ago and always told me I deserved better. She said marriage shouldn't feel like a prison sentence. She said I was too young to settle for someone who treated me like furniture. I started believing her. Then in March, I ran into Connor Hayes at the grocery store. Connor had been my boyfriend in college before I met David. We dated for 2 years, and it had been intense, passionate, the kind of relationship that burned hot. We broke up because he moved to Boston for work, and neither of us wanted long distance. But he was back now, standing in the produce section, looking exactly like I remembered. Same confident smile, same way of looking at me like I was the only person in the room. We talked for 20 minutes. He asked about my life, actually listened. He remembered details about me that David had never bothered to learn. My favorite movies. The trip to California I'd always wanted to take, the way I used to paint watercolors. Before we parted, he suggested we get coffee sometime. Catch up properly. As friends, of course. I said yes without hesitation. I didn't tell David about running into Connor. It seemed easier not to. David wouldn't have cared anyway. He barely noticed when I came home late from work, much less who I'd bumped into at the store. Connor and I met for coffee the following week. It was innocent at first. We talked about old times, about how our lives had turned out. He was single, working as a sales manager, living in an apartment downtown. He asked about my marriage, and I found myself being honest in a way I hadn't been with anyone. I told him David and I had grown apart, that we were more like roommates than spouses, that I felt invisible in my own home. Connor listened, really listened. He said I deserved someone who appreciated me, someone who made me feel alive. I went home that night feeling lighter than I had in years. We started meeting regularly. Coffee became lunch, lunch became dinner. I told David I was meeting my sister or staying late at work. He never questioned it. Maybe he was relieved to have the house to himself. Connor made me laugh. He complimented my appearance. He texted me throughout the day with jokes and observations. He made me feel young again, desirable again, like I mattered. I knew what I was doing. I'm not stupid. But I told myself it wasn't really cheating. We were just talking, just enjoying each other's company. David had emotionally abandoned me long ago, so what did it matter if I found happiness elsewhere? Rebecca agreed with me. She said emotional neglect was just as bad as infidelity. She said David had broken our marriage vows first by refusing to prioritize me. She said I had every right to seek fulfillment. By May, Connor and I were meeting 3 times a week. We'd drive to restaurants in neighboring towns where no one would recognize us. We'd sit close in booth seats, our legs touching under the table. He'd brush hair from my face. I'd let his hand linger on my arm. One night, after several glasses of wine, we kissed in his car. It felt like coming home and running away at the same time, thrilling and terrifying and completely right. I went home to David watching television, oblivious to everything. I felt guilty for maybe 10 minutes. Then I looked at him, slouched on the couch in his old sweatpants, and the guilt evaporated. This was his fault. If he'd paid attention to me, if he'd made any effort at all, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere. Connor wanted more. He wanted me to leave David. He said we could be together properly, the way we should have been years ago. He painted pictures of weekend trips and spontaneous adventures, and actually living instead of just surviving. I told him I needed time. The truth was, I wasn't ready to blow up my life. I liked having the stability of my marriage and the excitement of Connor. I liked feeling wanted, while also having the security of a shared home and combined income. It was selfish, I know that, but David didn't care enough to notice, so where was the harm? Our anniversary fell on a Friday in late June. The 10th of June. 8 years since we'd gotten married in a simple courthouse ceremony with just our parents present. David had mentioned the previous weekend that we should probably do something. I'd agreed vaguely, expecting he'd forget like he forgot most things. But on Monday, he surprised me. He said he'd made reservations at Rosewood Grill, the nicest restaurant in town. The place we'd gone on our first real date. He said he'd booked a table for 7 o'clock and was looking forward to a proper evening together. I was stunned. David never took initiative with dates. He never planned anything romantic. For a moment, I felt something close to hope. Maybe he'd finally realized what he'd been neglecting. Maybe this was his way of trying to fix us. Then Connor texted me. He was only in town until Saturday morning. He had to return to Boston for a month for work. He wanted to see me Friday night. One last dinner before he left. I stared at my phone for a long time. I should have told Connor no. I should have honored my commitment to my husband. But something stubborn and angry rose up in me. Why should I cancel my plans just because David suddenly decided to make an effort? Where had this energy been for the past 8 years? Besides, David would probably be boring company. We'd sit in awkward silence, pick at our food, and be home by 8:30. Connor would make me laugh. Connor would make me feel beautiful. Connor was leaving, and I didn't know when I'd see him again. I told Connor yes. Then I convinced myself I could handle both. The plan formed in my mind. Rosewood Grill was huge, with multiple dining rooms. If I timed it right, I could meet David for a drink, claim I felt sick, and leave early. Then I'd meet Connor on the other side of the restaurant. David would never know. It was reckless and stupid, but I was tired of being careful. Tired of putting David's feelings first when he'd never done the same for me. Friday arrived. I spent extra time on my makeup and wore a black dress Connor had said he loved. David was working late, so we'd agreed to meet directly at the restaurant. I arrived at 6:45, my heart pounding. David wasn't there yet. Good. That gave me time to check the layout. The restaurant had 3 dining sections separated by decorative partitions. David's reservation was in the main room near the windows. Connor had booked a table in the back section, around a corner and out of sight. I could make this work. David arrived at 7 sharp, wearing the sport coat I'd bought him 2 Christmases ago. He smiled when he saw me and said I looked nice. I felt a flicker of something. Regret, maybe, or recognition that I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. We were seated at our table. David had brought flowers, carnations in a simple bouquet. He seemed nervous, kept adjusting his silverware. He said he was glad we were doing this, that he knew things had been distant between us, that he wanted to work on our marriage. I felt sick, actually physically sick, because his words were everything I'd wanted to hear 6 months ago. But now they felt too late, insufficient, like putting a Band-Aid on a severed limb. My phone buzzed, Connor asking if I was on my way. David was talking about maybe taking a vacation together, somewhere I wanted to go. California, even. He'd been saving up. I couldn't do this. Couldn't sit here pretending everything was fine while Connor waited for me. Couldn't keep living this double life. So I made a choice. The wrong choice, obviously. But in that moment, it felt like the only choice. I told David I felt suddenly ill. Nausea, dizziness, probably something I ate at lunch. He looked concerned, started to stand, offered to take me home. I insisted I just needed to go to the bathroom and splash cold water on my face. If I still felt bad, I'd drive myself home and he should stay and enjoy his meal. We could reschedule. He protested. I insisted. Finally, he agreed, looking disappointed and worried. I went to the bathroom and stayed there for 10 minutes, letting him wonder. Then I texted him saying I felt terrible and was going straight home to lie down. I was sorry. We'd do this another night. His response came immediately. He asked if I needed him to come with me. I said no, stay and eat. Don't let the reservation go to waste. I'd be fine. I watched from the bathroom hallway as the waitress approached his table. Saw his shoulders slump as he read my message. Saw him sit there alone, looking at the empty chair across from him. Then I walked to the other side of the restaurant where Connor was waiting. Connor stood when he saw me, his face lighting up. He pulled out my chair and said I looked stunning. The waitress brought champagne he'd already ordered. He toasted to us, to new beginnings, to finally being together without hiding. I should have felt guilty. I should have run back to David. But Connor made me feel wanted in a way David never had. He asked about my day, laughed at my stories, looked at me like I was precious, like I mattered. We ordered appetizers. Connor talked about his plans, about how he wanted me to visit him in Boston, about how we could make this work even with the distance. He reached across the table and took my hand. That's when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. David, walking past with the waitress, heading toward the bathroom or maybe leaving. I don't know. I froze, my hand still in Connor's, champagne glass halfway to my lips. Our eyes met across the partition, the look on his face. I'll never forget it. Not anger, not even surprise, just complete devastation, like watching everything he believed in crumble in real time. He stood there for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. Connor asked if I was okay. I said fine, just saw someone I knew. He didn't push it. We finished our dinner, though I could barely taste the food. My phone stayed silent. David didn't text, didn't call, nothing. I drove home around 10. David's car was in the driveway, but all the lights were off. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to say, how to explain. Finally, I went inside. David was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. The flowers from the restaurant were in the trash, petals scattered across the floor. He didn't look at me when I entered. He asked where I'd really been. His voice was completely flat, empty. I tried to lie. Said I had been sick, that I'd gone home and fallen asleep on the couch, that I'd just gone out to get medicine from the pharmacy. He said, stop, just stop. He saw me with another man, holding hands, drinking champagne. In the same restaurant where I'd left him, sitting alone on our anniversary. Something in me snapped. Instead of apologizing, I got defensive, angry. I told him this was his fault, that he'd ignored me for years, that he'd stopped trying in our marriage, that I was lonely, and Connor made me feel alive. David finally looked at me. He said he'd made that reservation 6 weeks ago, that he'd been planning this evening for weeks, That he'd noticed we'd been growing apart and wanted to fix it. That he'd bought flowers and worn his good jacket and tried to do something special, and I'd abandoned him for someone else. I told him he was overreacting. It was just dinner. He was acting like I'd committed murder. He needed to calm down. He stood up, told me to leave, to get out of the house, to go be with Connor if that's what I wanted. He couldn't look at me. I refused. This was my house too. I wasn't going anywhere. He was being dramatic. David went to our bedroom and locked the door. I slept on the couch. Neither of us went to work the next day. Saturday morning, his mother called me. She'd heard from David that we were having problems. She asked what happened. I gave her a sanitized version, said we'd had a misunderstanding about dinner plans, that David was blowing things out of proportion. She went quiet. Then she asked if there was someone else. If I was seeing another man, I denied it, said David was being paranoid, that there was no one else and he was inventing problems. She said David was her son, and she knew when he was truly hurt. She said whatever I'd done, I needed to fix it. Then she hung up. By Sunday morning, both sets of parents knew something was wrong. My mother called, demanding to know why David's family was saying I'd humiliated him. I tried to control the narrative, told her David and I had a fight about me leaving our anniversary dinner early because I felt sick, that he was being unreasonable. She asked directly if I was having an affair. I hesitated too long before denying it. Mom said she didn't raise me to be a cheater, that if I was unhappy, I should have divorced David before running around with other men, that I'd disgraced myself and our family. She took David's side. My own mother took his side. Rebecca was the only one who understood. She said everyone was being too harsh, that marriages were complicated, that David had neglected me and pushed me into Connor's arms, that I deserved happiness. I clung to her validation like a life raft. David finally emerged from the bedroom Monday evening. He said he'd called a lawyer. He was filing for divorce. He wanted me out of the house by the end of the week. I laughed. Actually laughed. Told him he was being ridiculous. One dinner and he was ready to throw away 8 years. He was proving exactly why I'd looked elsewhere. He was weak and dramatic and pathetic. He didn't yell, didn't argue, just said he'd already found an apartment and would be moved out by Wednesday. I could have the house. He didn't care about possessions. He just wanted away from me. That's when I realized he was serious. I tried a different approach. Tears. Apologies. I said I'd made a mistake, that Connor meant nothing, that I wanted to work on our marriage. David shook his head. He said he could have forgiven the affair. Maybe. Eventually. But watching me lie, watching me blame him, watching me show zero remorse had killed whatever love remained. He said I wasn't the person he married. Or maybe I was, and he'd just been too blind to see it. He left for work the next morning and didn't come home that night, or the next. By Thursday, half his belongings were gone. I called Connor, desperate and angry, told him everything, expected comfort and support. Instead, he went quiet. He said he'd enjoyed our time together, but he wasn't ready for a serious relationship, that things had gotten too messy too fast, that maybe we should take a break while I sorted out my divorce. He was backing away. I could hear it in his voice. I begged, reminded him of everything he'd said, about us being together properly, about new beginnings. He said those were just fantasies. Reality was messier. He didn't want to be responsible for destroying my marriage. He needed space. He stopped returning my calls after that. So I'd lost my husband for a man who didn't even want me. The humiliation spread quickly. David's sister posted something on social media about people who destroy families through selfishness. She didn't name me, but everyone knew. Co-workers at the dental office started treating me differently. Cold, distant. The dentist I worked for, Dr. Montgomery, called me into his office. He said several patients had complained about me, though he wouldn't specify why. He suggested I might want to consider looking for another position. I was being pushed out of my job. My friends stopped inviting me to gatherings. Group texts went silent. Plans were made without me. Rebecca said they were being judgmental and small-minded, but I knew the truth. They'd all chosen David. I tried to control the damage, posted carefully curated photos on social media, vague quotes about growth and change and toxic relationships, tried to hint that David had been controlling or neglectful without saying it outright. People saw through it immediately. The comments ranged from criticism to outright cruelty. Someone posted a screenshot of me at the restaurant with Connor, tagged me in it, asked how my marriage was going. I deleted my accounts. David's parents came to collect his remaining belongings. His mother wouldn't look at me. His father said he'd always thought I was a good person, that he was disappointed in who I'd become. I told them they didn't know the full story. That David had been emotionally absent for years, that I'd been suffering in silence while he ignored me. David's mother finally looked at me. She said her son had been planning surprises for our anniversary for 2 months, that he'd asked her advice on romantic gestures, that he'd been trying to reconnect with me in small ways that I'd apparently been too distracted to notice. She said I'd broken a good man's heart over attention from someone who didn't even want me. Then they left with boxes of David's things, and I was alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous. My mother called again. She'd heard from multiple sources what actually happened, that I'd left David sitting alone in a restaurant on our anniversary to be with another man in the same building, that I'd lied about being sick, that everyone had seen me. She asked if it was true. I couldn't lie anymore. Said yes, but explained my reasons: the loneliness, the neglect, David's failures as a husband. She cut me off, said nothing justified what I'd done, that I'd humiliated myself and everyone associated with me, that she was ashamed to call me her daughter. She said not to come around for Sunday dinners anymore, that I wasn't welcome until I made serious changes. Even my family had abandoned me. The divorce papers arrived in July. David was asking for almost nothing. He'd take his personal belongings, his car, and half of our small savings account. I could keep the house, the furniture, everything else. He just wanted it done quickly. His lawyer called me, said David had been remarkably fair considering the circumstances, that I should count myself lucky he wasn't pursuing anything more, that I should sign the papers and let him move on with his life. I refused, not because I wanted to stay married. I didn't, but because everyone was treating me like the villain when David shared the blame. He'd driven me away with his indifference. He'd failed me first. I hired my own lawyer, asked if there was any way to prove emotional abandonment or neglect, any way to shift some blame onto David. The lawyer looked at me like I was delusional. He said I'd committed adultery in a very public, humiliating manner, that I had no grounds for claiming victim status, that fighting the divorce would only make me look worse and cost more money. I fired him and represented myself. At the first hearing, David showed up with his lawyer and his sister for support. I came alone. Rebecca had a work conflict, or so she said. The judge asked if we'd attempted reconciliation. David's lawyer presented a timeline: the anniversary dinner, the affair, David's attempts to save the marriage, my continued relationship with Connor, even after being caught, except that last part wasn't true. Connor had ghosted me weeks ago, but I'd been texting him constantly, desperately, and apparently David had seen those messages before he left. The judge looked at me with barely concealed disgust, asked if I had anything to say in my defense. I tried to explain about the loneliness, about David's emotional absence, about how I'd been suffering for years. The judge cut me off, said this was a legal proceeding about dissolving a marriage, not a therapy session, that the facts were clear. Asked if I was contesting the terms David proposed. I said I wanted the house valued and sold, with profits split. Wanted alimony, wanted him to pay my legal fees, since this was partially his fault. David's lawyer actually laughed, said I'd destroyed the marriage through infidelity, had no grounds for alimony, and could keep the house David was generously offering. The judge agreed, said I should be grateful for David's reasonable terms. Scheduled a final hearing for August. I left humiliated and furious. Work deteriorated further. Dr. Montgomery called me in again. Said he'd received complaints from 3 more patients who'd specifically requested not to work with me. That the situation was affecting the practice. That he was giving me 2 weeks' notice. I was being fired. I asked if this was even legal. He said I was an at-will employee and he could terminate for any reason. That I should use the 2 weeks to find other employment. I filed for unemployment. The claim was denied. I appealed. It was denied again. My finances collapsed quickly. The house payment was too much for just my income. Bills piled up. I drained my half of the savings David left me. I tried to find other work, sent out dozens of applications, got 3 interviews. None led to offers. One office manager told me privately that I had a reputation in town, that nobody wanted drama in their workplace. I was blacklisted. Rebecca suggested I move away, start fresh somewhere nobody knew me, but I couldn't afford to move, could barely afford groceries. I reached out to Connor one final time, told him I'd left David for him, that I'd lost everything, asked if we could try again. He finally responded, said he'd never asked me to leave David, that our affair had been fun but was never meant to be serious, that I'd made choices he wasn't responsible for. Then he blocked me. I'd destroyed my life for someone who considered me a pleasant distraction. In August, my mother called, said my father was having a birthday dinner, that I could come if I wanted, but I needed to understand that David had been invited too, that he was more family to them than I was right now. I asked how she could choose him over me. I was her daughter. She said I'd made my choices and now had to live with them. That blood didn't excuse behavior. That respect had to be earned. I didn't go to the dinner. Rebecca's support began to crack too. She'd been my constant defender, but even she started making comments about how I needed to take some responsibility, about how my behavior after the affair was worse than the affair itself, about how I was playing victim when I'd caused the situation. I told her she was betraying me, that she'd encouraged me to follow my heart, to demand better treatment, to leave David if I was unhappy. She said she'd encouraged me to leave David or work on the marriage, not to cheat on him publicly while pretending to be committed, that I'd twisted her advice into permission for cruelty. I stopped calling her. The final divorce hearing approached. I'd prepared a statement about David's emotional failings, about how the marriage was broken long before Connor appeared, about how I deserved understanding, not condemnation. David's lawyer filed a motion to prevent me from speaking beyond answering direct questions, said I'd attempted to slander David in previous proceedings, that I'd shown no remorse or accountability. The judge granted the motion. The hearing lasted 15 minutes. The judge reviewed the agreement, asked David if these terms were acceptable. He said yes, asked me the same. I tried to launch into my prepared statement. The judge gavelled me silent, told me to answer yes or no. I said no. These terms weren't fair. I wanted more time to negotiate. David's lawyer presented evidence that I'd been stalling for months, that David had been beyond reasonable, that I was attempting to punish him for ending the marriage I'd destroyed. The judge reviewed everything, then granted the divorce on David's original terms, said I had 30 days to refinance the house in my name only or sell it. That was it. We were done. David walked out without looking at me. His sister squeezed his shoulder. His lawyer shook his hand. They looked relieved. I sat alone in the courtroom, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. September arrived with a foreclosure notice. I couldn't refinance the house. My credit was poor, my income non-existent. The bank gave me 90 days to sell, or they'd take it. I called David. It was the first time we'd spoken directly since the divorce finalized. I asked if he'd consider buying me out of the house, said I had nowhere to go. He said that wasn't his problem anymore, that I'd made my choices, that he'd moved on, and I should too. I heard a woman's voice in the background asking if everything was okay. He'd already found someone else. The jealousy and rage that surged through me was overwhelming. I called him pathetic, said he was replacing me like I'd never mattered, said whoever she was, she'd learn what a boring, absent, neglectful husband he made. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said the difference was this woman would get the version of him that tried, the version that planned surprises and made efforts and communicated, the version that I'd killed through contempt and selfishness. He said he'd wasted 8 years on someone who never appreciated him, who'd thrown away everything good for validation from a man who didn't even want her. He said I needed help, professional help, that my inability to accept responsibility for anything was going to ruin my entire life. Then he hung up. I had no response, no comeback, because somewhere deep down, I knew he was right, but admitting that felt impossible. I listed the house. The real estate market was slow. Weeks passed with no offers. The bank called repeatedly. I screened the calls. In October, Rebecca called, said she'd heard I was losing the house, asked if I needed a place to stay temporarily. I accepted, desperate and humiliated. I moved into her spare bedroom with 2 suitcases of belongings. Everything else went to storage I couldn't afford or was sold at a loss. The house eventually went to auction. I got nothing from it. Rebecca's support came with conditions. She wanted me to start therapy, to actually work on understanding my behavior, to stop blaming everyone else. I agreed to shut her up, but I resented it. I didn't need therapy. I needed people to understand my perspective. At family Thanksgiving, I wasn't invited. Mum sent a brief text saying they were keeping it small this year, code for I wasn't welcome. I spent the holiday alone in Rebecca's apartment, eating Chinese takeout and scrolling through social media. Photos of my parents' house, full of relatives and friends. Photos of happy families. David posted a picture with his new girlfriend, looking genuinely content. Everyone had moved on except me. Rebecca came home that evening and found me crying. She sat down and asked what I actually wanted. Did I want David back? Did I want Connor? Or did I just want to not feel like the villain? I couldn't answer. Didn't know. She said until I figured that out, until I took actual responsibility instead of just going through motions, nothing would change. December came. The year was ending and I had nothing to show but wreckage. No husband, no job, no home, no friends. My family barely spoke to me. My sister was losing patience. I finally went to a therapist, mostly because Rebecca insisted. The therapist asked me to describe what happened in my marriage. I launched into my prepared narrative about David's failures, about feeling neglected, about finding connection with Connor. The therapist let me talk for 40 minutes, then asked why I'd stayed married if I was so unhappy. The question caught me off guard. I said I'd been trying to make it work, that I'd hoped David would change. The therapist asked if I'd communicated clearly about my needs, if I'd suggested counseling, if I'd given David any indication of how serious the problems were before seeking outside attention. I said he should have known, should have noticed. The therapist asked why I'd chosen to betray him in such a public, humiliating manner if my goal was to fix the marriage. I had no good answer. The therapist said something I've replayed 1,000 times, that hurt people, that my action suggested I wanted David to suffer as I'd suffered, that the restaurant incident wasn't about being caught unexpectedly, but about ensuring maximum damage, that I'd sabotaged my marriage not to escape it, but to destroy it so completely that repair was impossible. I never went back to that therapist. On the last Friday of December, I got a message from an unknown number. It was Connor. He said he'd heard through mutual connections that I was struggling. He felt bad about how things ended, asked if I wanted to meet for coffee and talk. Part of me screamed not to go, but I was lonely and desperate, and still, somehow hoping he'd say it had all been a mistake, that he wanted me after all. We met at a coffee shop across town. Connor looked good, happy, settled. He'd gotten engaged over the holidays to someone he'd been dating for 4 months. He showed me pictures. She was beautiful and successful, and everything I wasn't anymore. He said he'd reached out because he felt guilty, that our affair had spiraled into something neither of us intended, that he hoped I was doing okay. I asked if he'd ever loved me, if anything between us had been real. Connor looked uncomfortable. He said he'd cared about me, that I'd been going through a hard time, and he'd enjoyed being there for me. But no, it hadn't been love. It had been nostalgia and physical attraction and ego. He said he hoped I'd find peace. Then he left to pick up his fiancée. I sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours, finally understanding the full scope of what I'd done. I'd destroyed a stable marriage for a fantasy. I'd hurt a man who'd loved me for attention from someone who'd never wanted anything real. I'd alienated everyone who mattered for validation that disappeared the moment it became inconvenient. And I'd done it all while convinced I was the victim. The year ended alone in Rebecca's apartment. No celebration, no hope for new beginnings. Just the crushing weight of consequences I'd spent months refusing to acknowledge. David was right. I did need help. But more than that, I needed to stop running from the truth. On New Year's Day, I finally wrote David a letter, not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation, just acknowledging, honestly and completely, what I'd done. The betrayal, the cruelty, the selfishness. How he'd deserved better. How I'd thrown away something real for something hollow. I didn't mail it. I knew he'd moved on, that my apologies were years too late and ultimately selfish in themselves. But I wrote it anyway. And in the writing, something cracked open. The careful justifications I'd built. The blame I'd distributed everywhere but at my own feet. The narrative where I was wronged instead of wrong. Rebecca found me that evening, the unmailed letter on the table. She read it without asking permission. Then she looked at me and asked if I meant it. I said yes. Finally, fully, yes. She said good, that it was a start. That accountability wouldn't fix what I'd broken, but it might prevent me from destroying whatever came next. I stayed with Rebecca for 8 more months. Got a job at a call center in the next town when nobody knew my history. Started actual therapy, the kind where I had to sit with uncomfortable truths instead of fishing for validation. Slowly, painfully, began building something that resembled a life. My parents eventually allowed supervised visits. Thanksgiving, Christmas. They were civil but distant. Trust once shattered doesn't regrow quickly. I never saw David again, heard through the remnants of my social circle that he'd gotten engaged, that he was happy, that he'd somehow found the grace to move forward without bitterness. I was glad for him, and devastated for myself. Not because I wanted him back, but because I'd had that and destroyed it through my own selfish choices. Sometimes I still wonder if I was wrong. Then I remember his face across that restaurant, the wilting flowers, the empty chair. The man who'd tried one last time to save us while I chose someone else. And I remember that loneliness isn't an excuse. That feeling neglected doesn't justify betrayal. That I wasn't the villain by accident or circumstance. I chose it. Every step, every lie, every justification. Maybe that's not the comfortable truth people want, but it's the one I live with now. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.